Okay, now let's talk about part of section 8.3 that covers the light-dependent reactions, or just for short, the light reactions. All right, so here's a question I want you to keep in mind as we cover this. Why does a chloroplast have so many membranes? Or, in other words, why is the thylakoid membrane, the one on the inside of the chloroplast, so complex? Why is there so much of that thylakoid membrane? Again, recall from the previous section, this is the overall look at photosynthesis, the light-dependent reactions on one side that make use of sunlight energy. The pigments harness that energy. We're going to generate these energized molecules. In the process, we're going to split water and generate some oxygen. And on the other side, the light-independent reactions, what is primarily known as the Calvin cycle here, powered by NADPH and ATP, taking in CO2, using the energy from these molecules to convert CO2 or multiple CO2 molecules into a more complex sugar molecules. In the process, regenerating ADP and NADP plus, which go back to the light reactions to be converted back into NADPH and ATP. So these guys are just going back and forth, gaining energy, giving up energy, coming back to gain energy, and back to the Calvin cycle. All right, so now let's focus on this side, the light-dependent reactions, the ones that need sunlight in order to operate. So this is all happening on the thylakoid membrane inside the chloroplast, this complex membrane. Again, each of these mesophyll cells, the ones inside the leaf that do the photosynthesis, are packed full of chloroplasts. And so these light-dependent reactions happen on the thylakoid membrane. And so when you have lots of that membrane, you have lots of space, lots of surface area over which this reaction can occur. All right, so now let's take a look at these reactions. And so we say reactions because it is a series of reactions that allows a plant to harness sunlight energy and convert it into chemical energy. And so here's the image from our book. It's kind of busy, a lot going on, but let's see if we can work through this. So we have what we call photosystems, okay, and there's two of them here, photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, and they work together. And there'll be other groupings of these photosystems on the thylakoid, but we'll just look at one cluster of them. And again, the photosystems work together to harness sunlight energy. So there's photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, and they are basically a cluster of pigments, chlorophylls, xanthophylls, carotenoids, etc., that basically gather sunlight energy. Okay, so they absorb that sunlight energy, and what happens is that energy gets these pigment molecules so excited, in particular chlorophyll A, and when chlorophyll A gets really excited, it releases energized electrons. And so that's what's being shown here, is sort of at the center of this photosystem, you'll have chlorophyll A molecules that are releasing energized electrons. All right, so what happens is these energized electrons are passed along through an electron transport chain, okay? That electron transport chain has a series of molecules, sort of represented by this purple and this pinkish thing, that are known as cytochromes. And these cytochromes just take an electron, pass it along, take an electron, pass it along. And what happens is the energy from those electrons that are being passed along is used to do active transport. And that's what's being shown here with this hydrogen ion and this blue line here, is that these energized electrons are allowing this electron transport chain to actively move hydrogen ions across the thylakoid membrane into the lumen of the thylakoid, or that thylakoid space. And so each of these blue dots represents a hydrogen ion that has been actively moved and concentrated inside the lumen of the thylakoid. All right, so that's from the first photosystem, actually what's called photosystem 2. Photosystem 2 comes first, and then photosystem 1 comes second. Now, the reason that is photosystem 1 was discovered first, and they said, oh, here's photosystem. And then the next one was discovered, and they said, oh, there's photosystem 2. But when they worked out the system, they realized that in the order in which the electrons are passed along, it actually starts with photosystem 2. So that's a little confusing, but that's the way it goes. All right, so in providing energy to do this active transport, the electrons essentially lose energy, but then they're passed to photosystem 1, where they are re-energized by more sunlight and another cluster of pigments. And these newly re-energized electrons are passed to another electron transport chain that essentially provides the energy to convert NADP plus into NADPH. Okay? So first, the energy from electrons is used to actively transport hydrogens into the lumen of the thylakoid. And then those re-energized electrons are used to help facilitate the reaction of converting NADP plus to NADPH. All right, so there's one of the molecules we need to generate the light reactions, but now we need to figure out how to make ATP. Well, what happens is now we've got all these hydrogen ions clustered inside the lumen here, and they would like to get back across the membrane, okay? Because again, there's more of them here and there's fewer of them there, and we know by diffusion that things like to go from where there's more of them to where there's fewer of them. Well, they're ions, they have a positive charge. They can't cross the phospholipid bilayer of the thylakoid membrane. But how can they get across? Well, that's where this molecule ATP synthase comes along. It's a protein embedded in the thylakoid membrane, and it provides a pathway for these things to diffuse back out, essentially facilitated diffusion. Now, what happens as these hydrogen ions are moving through ATP synthase, they essentially cause ATP synthase to convert ADP into ATP, to synthesize ATP. And those hydrogen ions are back out here. Well, then back here, we'll use the electron transport chain to pump them back in, so they're just kind of going back and forth. But on one side, they're being actively transported in, and on the other end, they diffuse out through ATP synthase. Okay, so now we've got the two molecules we need to make, and they are going to go to the light-independent reactions, or the Calvin cycle, where we're going to turn several CO2 molecules into some simple sugars. All right, so the electron transport chain, so it basically passes along electrons, uses the energy from these electrons to do work. With, again, the first electron transport chain, we're pumping hydrogen ions in. Hydrogen ions, active transport into the lumen. And then we have a second, so that's sort of the first one. Then we have a second electron transport chain, which is used to basically convert NADP plus into NADPH. All right, so these hydrogen ions that have been pumped into the lumen, again, ATP synthase allows them to essentially diffuse back across the membrane, so outside of the lumen. And in the process, we're going to convert ADP into ATP. Now, of course, this is plus a phosphate group, diphosphate, triphosphate. And so now our NADPH and ATP are available to go to the Calvin cycle. And we'll talk about the Calvin cycle and some other things in another video.